So there is a progression, like a pipeline for it to happen, but in those moments online, there's that sort of roiling outrage machine. I think this is where the appeal of the sort of Marcus Aurelius quote was just the idea that you actually can check out. Like, you really don't have to weigh in. It's kind of a freeing experience when you realize that the world doesn't need your take, you know? Did you know you're cited in there?
I was going to ask.
It's funny because when I got the inbound from your people, I was like, oh, that's so funny. And then I was like, I remember where I was when I read your book, actually.
Really?
Yeah, we can talk about it on air if you want to, but it was, all right. I think Marcus Aurelius is also cited in there, funny enough.
Well,
and I remember that because the fact checkers, I hired my own fact checkers for this because I was like, I'm going to get sued if I don't, you know?
Well, also people assume that a publisher includes fact checking, which it emphatically does not.
It does not at all.
And there are all the, I mean, this is basically what your book is about, but there's all these parts of society that we assume like adults are like in charge of or like
that are
checking. And there's all these just, it's crazy. But no, I was trying to see if I was in it, but I couldn't.
You're in a footnote. I don't know if they put you in the index, but you are most definitely 100% in, because I actually control F'd and I was like, I'm glad that you brought that out, actually. I can literally tell the story. I remember where I was when I read your book.
When was this?
It was in 2014. My son was 6 months old, and I was on the Russian River. It was like it was like a beach, obviously, but
yeah,
it was like riverbank read. I was so excited that I was finally getting a break from the baby. My husband had him for a bit, and what I remembered about it was by this point I had started doing the work I do now, not in any kind of professional capacity, just as like an amateur. And I read your book and I was like, shit, here's somebody else who's saying it. Like, it's in writing. I'm not crazy. It was very validating, actually.
Well,
yeah.
I didn't make the acknowledgments, which is very disappointing.
Sorry.
I mean, not the acknowledgments, the index. That was one of my...
But you're definitely in the footnotes.
I remember when I was doing my first book, I was like, do I have to make the index? Like, is that my responsibility? And then they're like, no, we take care of it. And I was like, oh, okay, great. And then I never thought about it again. And then I was like checking one of my royalty statements and they charge you for someone else doing the index. And I was like, I just wouldn't have done an index then.
Oh, that's funny. I didn't even look at that. They gave me the index and it was like way too overlong with way too many niche words. Yeah. And I was like, this does not need, nobody's going to look up this word.
No one uses it at all.
Yeah.
Even on my own books, sometimes I'll pull them up on Google Books to search them to find something.
Yeah, I have the PDF. I literally have the PDF just so I could, But no, you're cited in there.
Well, it was funny when I wrote that book, which seems insane to me that I wrote a book basically about fake news before fake news was a thing. But in 2000, I was writing that book in 2011 and researching it in 2010, which is, I don't feel like I could have done something that long ago. But I vividly remember the reception to that book, which was not good. Like,
I think I remember. I think I looked at your. I read. So I pulled down the current version, right?
Yeah.
Because I'd read that you'd done like some update or something. And
I think like 3 times.
Oh, did it 3 times now? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I was like, look, okay, I read this in 2014. I should review it again. I think you had mentioned in there doing the revision, and then I did look at the media coverage, right?
Yeah.
Because I remember I was on Help a Reporter Out. I was a traitor. I was at Jane Street at the time. I don't know if you want to talk about this on camera, but okay.
I was thinking when I did that book that people would be like, thank you for pointing this out, right? And what actually happened is sort of marketing people. I wanted to write a book about media criticism, but when you look at it, basically books of media criticism never sell.
Yeah.
They get lots of media coverage and they never sell. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna show how to do it as a way to get people to actually read it. But I thought people in media would be smart enough to go like, oh, okay, this is the device he's using, but it's fundamentally saying things that we're concerned about. But it was very interesting to watch. Basically, I remember being portrayed as the bad guy.
Yeah.
As some sort of like lone actor who, if people just didn't do stuff like this, the system would work fine. And then it's not a thing I am super excited to have been proven right about.
Right.
Over the subsequent years.
Right. That's sort of how I felt too with a lot of the writing I was doing in 2014, 2015. I felt like I had to, I was in venture capital and I had a startup.
Yeah.
And so this was not my job, right? And I just felt like I'd seen the future and I had to tell people, like, not even the future, I'd seen like the present. Yeah. It was already happening.
Well, isn't
but it was only going to increase. And I felt like I had to, somehow make clear like what was different and how it worked. And I remember being at the CDC, right, and having this conversation it would have been like, God, 2015, mid 2015 or so, and saying like, you guys have to realize this is happening.
Yeah.
And them saying like, oh, that's just some people on the internet. I was like, oh my God, this is going to be a disaster.
Well,
they do not get it.
You have this sense that there's people whose job it is to understand the industry that they're in.
Right.
And then you realize like, oh, that's not true. Like you don't get how it works. And definitely the people whose job it is to like, sort of prevent things from happening don't get how it works. And you kind of have this like insight into like, oh, no, this is what's actually happening. And then you think, oh, if I just tell people about it, that will fix things.
I think they'll magically figure out how to react. And that's just not true. And then having it, my own experience, and like the book does become something of a memoir as it starts to happen to me, was realizing that I was then constrained by what was essentially institutional comms that didn't know what it was doing.
Yeah.
And we had this really, kind of, honestly, one of the most frustrating experiences of my life, candidly, where we're saying like, okay, when we're constantly telling election officials and public health officials and so on and so forth, no, you need to be proactive, you need to be speaking, you can't let the narrative get established without you in it, right? Got to be transparent, got to be clear, got to be direct. And then, and then your own institution is like, shut up and say nothing, And you're like, this is the wrong advice. Like, this is the wrong advice. What do I do about that? How am I, how do you buck that, and how do you try to convince them that they're wrong? And realizing that what we knew to be true from studying how online rumors worked for 3.5 years, like in the most academic, like structures possible, like not practitioner at all. Like I said, I moved into academia in 2019, and then you realize that like it's the same as every other institution that's collapsing in the new system that doesn't understand what it's doing. That
was really striking to me because we see the media's job is to hold sort of institutions accountable, right? And they're really good for the most part at going like, okay, this is wrong. We uncovered this thing. We're going to expose this thing. And they sort of expect when they criticize an institution that the institution will take that criticism and change and respond and reform. And I just thought it was so interesting to watch the media's inability to do that to itself. There's a famous Latin saying about like who watches the watchman. And you realize like there actually isn't a great culture of accountability inside media.
Right.
And that's why, so I was like sort of shocked by that. And then I read this book. Did you read Upton Sinclair's book, The Brass Check?
No, I never read that one.
So after he wrote The Jungle, he wrote this, like a similar book. It's nonfiction instead of fiction, I guess. But he basically writes an expose of early 20th century media.
Oh, interesting.
And it's like about newspapers and wire services and yellow journalism and all this. He writes this huge because he's now this very famous figure and he's extremely left-wing. So and at that time, newspapers were sort of puppets of capitalists, right? It was like it was its own industry. Right. And so he's like, this is a constant target. And so he's kind of doing this book about what it's like to be covered by the media and how inaccuracies about him are spreading and just all the problems. I'll give it to you. It's in the bookstore. But he writes this, like, we celebrate The Jungle exposing the meatpacking industry. And then he writes this other book exposing the media, but we see the media as heroes. So that book doesn't have the same resonance because it's also a thing that very few people can relate to because you're not personally a recipient of it. You don't have the same experience.
Yeah.
But I remember just reading that book and going, oh, like this is the same thing. Like we've always had these problems and you realize kind of the vulnerability. He has this line in the book that I think about all the time. He's quoting someone. They say something like, but basically he's saying that like, we are dependent on the media to decide who we put in government. So we're really, and what laws we pass, what things we do. So basically we're dependent on what governs public opinion. Like how we find out about stuff is really the system we live in. And then you go, oh, we don't have a great system.
Yeah.
Like it's really vulnerable.
Well, and it's your book focused on what we still called media, right? Mm-hmm. You were talking about the era of the bloggers, the blogosphere. We still called them bloggers then,
Yeah. Oh,
now they're citizen journalists, and I felt like the influencers came a little bit later. I don't know if you
TikTok didn't exist.
Yeah. And there was also the idea that like we don't even position ourselves as media now, right? We have the reach of media, we have the sort of the megaphone of media, but we don't pretend to be journalists, right? That's not what we're doing. And and so that model of the influencer, I thought was just this really unique character that only exists like in this environment. You have celebrities previously, but you don't have the self-made we speak for this entire group of people. Like we are of that entire group of people. And so I saw that evolution from some of what Dan Gilmore wrote about citizen journalists and what you wrote about bloggers and this idea of like what is media, as all of a sudden everybody has the reach, but perhaps not even like a nod to the sort of ethics or you know just entirely this completely different beast. And so I wanted to write a little bit about that evolution, which I think was came out a little bit after, because you were writing in that era with that sort of Gawker was still the thing, right? I remember reading like Guest of a Guest and stuff. I was on Wall Street at the time, and being on Help a Reporter Out and, the sort of the newsletters and the things that you mention, and then watching that evolve even more into like, now we're just going to abandon the entire pretense of of what it means to be media. And we're just going straight into like, we're profoundly influential. And here's the incentives that govern like this new system that were even more, I think, self-interested than the ones that you were writing about 10 years ago.
Yeah, in the Upton Sinclair book, he's talking about basically it's like journalism was considered a low profession. So it didn't have like a social structure. It didn't have ethics. It didn't have like institutions that gave awards. It was just like, it was kind of a low-class profession. And so people just did whatever they could to get ahead in that position. And then sort of what comes out after that is like our modern conception of a journalist as this sort of heroic, ethical, like socially significant figure, which wasn't necessarily codified in the law, but it was codified culturally, that like to be a journalist meant you believe these things and you act according to these principles. Now, we didn't always live up to that. There was that. And I felt like what I was writing about was sort of the breakdown of some of that, and the idea of like, look, we say like a journalist shouldn't own stocks, or own stock in a company they're covering because there's a financial conflict of interest. But if you're paid by how many page views you get, then there's a conflict of interest. What I was struck by and thinking about when I was reading your book is like, what I got wrong, or what I was talking about this sort of corruption of sort of money and attention that's flooding into journalism. But what's interesting to me about where we are now is that in many cases, I guess I was overestimating the financial incentive as a problem. Like I was going like, people are doing this to get page views because they put a little ad unit there and they make a certain amount of money per page view. What's so interesting to me about our online culture is that it's not that it's disconnected from money, but it's much more just like a game of attention and fame and influence.
Yeah.
Weirdly, it's more ideological than I would have guessed, considering how non-ideological it was not that long ago.
Well, and I think that's because what you had in your era was there was still a sense that you had to appeal to a mass audience just a little bit more than there is today. And that's because it hadn't yet split into algorithmic curation in quite the same way, right? So a lot of the stuff related to feeds or related to what we now call like the interest graph and that sort of stuff, the ways that a platform determines who you are, right, tags you as being of a particular ideology. And it does it very fast too, right? And when you have that, then it means that you're just gonna see more of the thing that it's kind of tagged you as being.
Sure.
And if you're competing for attention as a creator in that economy, then what you're doing is you're trying to really double down and reinforce and reach that audience that is actually accessible to you, because there is no such thing as like the sort of mass audience where everybody had that unified experience, even in the early days of the internet, where, I think we probably all read some of the same blogs. They were, the sort of like superstar bloggers, were very much still a little bit more in that model of like a media class, a journalistic class. And then you do start to see that fragmentation as they begin to realize that feeding an algorithm and targeting a group is actually the path to sort of like what you might call like niche fame, niche power. And it does become like, you see people doing things for like, originally it's like fake internet points, right? But then you can actually monetize the fake internet points, and the realization that the clout that you have online can translate into everything from, paid placement or promos to now much more directly, like what Elon did with Twitter recently, where you can actually monetize your own feed, right? You can participate in rev share, which creates a whole new incentive structure for creators on that platform that wasn't there before. So
you kind of have these moments where you kind of get a peek behind the curtain, and it's hard to like see things the same way. I remember I was talking to this journalist at Gawker, and I was asking him to correct something, and he goes, like, what do you mean? He was like, I was like, this hurt this person's feelings. And he says something like, don't you understand this is like professional wrestling?
Yes.
And that was like a big part of
kayfabe, the whole thing.
Yeah, that was a big part of my understanding of sort of that era. And then it's funny, I moved to Austin in 2013, but I moved out here to Bastrop County in 2015. And where I was like, I thought I understood this stuff, and then I understood it in a new way. Do you know the Jade Helm?
Yes,
conspiracy?
Of course I do.
That was here.
I remember that.
That was here. So for people who don't know, the basically the U.S. National Guard, I guess the Army is doing a series of training exercises, as they always do. And somebody puts forth this conspiracy theory online that this is actually an attempt for the federal government to take over the states, which of course is nonsensical because the federal government is already taken over the states. We fought a whole war about this. But it was fascinating to watch like this thing bubble up and people get worried about it. And then if I remember correctly, the governor of Texas sends out the National Guard to observe so essentially setting forth potentially like a clash between state and federal troops. And I watched this happen, and then I remember thinking about it. What was so different than some of the things that I saw was like I couldn't see what was in it for anyone.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like
it was the Obama presidency, I think is also important to note, right? So there was this, my recollection of that was very much like, we're going to make sure that, the sort of Obama crew in Washington can't interfere in Texas sovereignty.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember where I was even living at the time. I think I would have been in New York at the time. But I remember that because we kind of made fun of it in New York.
Yes.
We're like, oh, there's Texas doing its thing again, But no, it was very much, it was what I found disturbing about it. And I remember it was in a slide deck I made for a talk, and the talk was called "The Lunatics Are Running the Asylum."
Yeah.
And what I remembered about it was that it was what I found disturbing was not that there were, people with weird theories about Obama or Texas or whatever else. It was that the sitting governor bolstered the conspiracy theory, right? That was what I thought, like, okay, that's sort of an alarming turn of events, right? Where people in charge of actually fairly massive economies, candidly, are feeding into this, are feeding the beast, and that they see this as a way to win points with the base by reinforcing the worst impulses. Well,
that's the subtitle of the book, right? If it trends, you can make it real. And so I think what was so striking to me about that thing was, first off, this wasn't like, here you had a crazy person or whatever making something up, although I guess later they found out there was like the hallmarks of sort of a Russian intelligence operation.
Yeah, they were very much in that one, yeah.
But so you have this crazy view that exists, but it's not like everyone is talking about it. It basically doesn't exist. It's so small it doesn't exist. But then someone for, again, not financial, like Greg Abbott is not propagating this theory for financial reasons.
Right.
He's propagating it for sort of political reasons and then taking real action. So you have this thing that's not real that becomes real and potentially has enormous consequences. It ends up sort of frittering away. But it was like, okay, it was just striking that something that's so nonsensical could generate a very nonsensical response. Yeah, and then like now you have a potential face-off between like actual troops over a thing that some crazy people think is real. And then there's kind of this person in the middle who knows better, but is doing it anyway, as if it's happening still on the internet, but it's not happening on the internet.
Right, it's in real life now, yes.
Yes.
I think that transition, again, this was the same thing when I think about the CDC person who's like, these are some people on the internet. Yeah. I was like, oh, you don't get it.
Yeah.
You really don't get it. Like those people have incredible power now, actually. Like that is the entire point, right? It is the it's the power of the online crowd to make something happen in real life that I think they haven't quite internalized yet.
Yes.
And this has been my frustration with a lot of the institutional responses we've seen. The idea that you can still shape public opinion just by putting out your fact check and in a PDF on your website, and you assume that like your authority remains unchallenged because you kind of have the benefit of the decades of trust, and you think that that's going to continue indefinitely into the future. And they don't see it as both real concerns, right? Yeah. Plus what you might call manufactured concerns, right? Yes. Where the realization that attacking an institution is actually quite lucrative now, right? It's going to, as you're alluding to with Jade Helm, right? You bolster your base by feeding into the nonsense, even if you know it's not true, because you derive your own value from that. And so the institutions are now in a position where they're both dropping the ball in real life and then also being unfairly tarred at times, and they don't know how to differentiate between these two things. And so largely their response is to shut up and say nothing. And then that just creates a sense that you'll be a punching bag forever, and you're going to continue to try to ride this reputation that you've had. And that's just not the way the world works anymore.
So what's the Marcus Aurelius quote in the book?
Oh, it was I'm going to butcher this, but the things have no power over you, right? You don't have to be obligated to respond in this moment. There's my paraphrase. You probably know the exact quote. But I was trying to explain it actually in the context of like, so how should the crowd react, right? When you see these things go by, what should you do? This is a question I get asked a lot. Do you quote tweet and mock them, right? Sometimes people do that. It's funny, right? It gets attention because it's speaking in like internet culture. Like, we're going to make fun of this. That's how we're going to dunk on it. And that's how we're going to get across the point that it's ridiculous. And that's very useful. I saw you wrote a lot about Alinsky and Rules for Radicals also, which is a thing that I think about constantly. Like, that book is always in my head. But the reason I used the Marcus Aurelius quote was just this idea that like, you don't actually have to do anything. You can let it go by. Yeah. Like, what an incredible experience it is to let someone be wrong on the internet without weighing in on it.
Yes. Well, it's like he talks about in Meditations how you have the power to have no opinion.
Yes.
And I've not always graded it, but what I've gotten better at spotting is going, okay, this person that's saying the thing, like, they may not be like, first off, what they're saying is not real, it's nonsense. They themselves may not be real, but what they are trying to get from me is a real response. So like I see sometimes like people sharing stuff, and I go, that what you're outraged about does not exist.
Yes, 100%.
It's not like we're talking about some fake controversy. What the opinion that you're upset about is so perfectly absurd that's the point. It was designed to make you angry and share it. Right. And that's the win. The win is not convincing anyone of anything. It's bogging you down in nonsense, and also getting you to feel a little bit more contempt, a little bit more frustrated, have a little bit more despair that everything is impossibly corrupted and broken, and like no one is understanding what's true or real, when really you're dealing with like a very small minority viewpoint that almost nobody shares. Right. And so the act of winning is not acknowledging that it's true. Not always, but a good chunk of the time.
I think that's exactly right. I think I think I talk about it. I'm trying to remember which example I was giving, but do you remember the situation Covington Catholic, right? There were these boys with the MAGA hats, and they were at the Lincoln, Washington monument area. And I remember I had gotten out of bed in California. I was living in California at the time. Everything's 3 hours behind. And I opened up my phone, and Twitter was absolutely outraged. My entire feed was outraged about this situation. And I was texting people, and I was like, what happened? Thinking there was like some actual violent confrontation or something. And they're like, well, these boys, these jerks, like, were yelling at this Native American elder. And I was like, by this point, I feel like I've seen enough of these things that I'm not going to weigh in. Yeah. The world does not need my contribution in this moment. Yeah, he looked a little bit like a jerk from the photo. I get it, But then, of course, what happens is you do see then the full video comes out later. The initial image is not conveying the truth of what happened. Then subsequently, 3 hours later, there is additional footage of, so these are for people who are not familiar with this necessarily, there were a kind of group of kids from I think Catholic school, maybe it was down in Kentucky, that had Covington Catholic was the name of the school, and they're wearing these MAGA hats. They're there for a protest, I think, or a march related to abortion rights in some capacity. there are some Native American elders who are there for a different reason. And you have this man with the drum and this boy with a MAGA hat, and it becomes something of an iconic image. It looks like they're facing off. And then what you come to find out several hours later, maybe almost 8 hours later, is that there had also been a third group, these Black Hebrew Israelites, right? And the Hebrew Israelites, if you've never encountered them, will just sort of scream things at you as you walk by, right? It's a very, the sort of belief that they're a kind of lost tribe of Israel, right? The sort of religious chosen ones. And so they will scream scripture and other things. And so they had been sort of instigating with the boys. They'd been going back and forth with the boys. The Native American group then kind of came and stood between them. And this was like the actual dynamics. But what was amazing about the entire thing was, one, depending on how you viewed that spectacle was entirely shaped by like what media universe you were in, right? And so depending on which online faction you were part of, you saw very, very different footage and arguments for what had happened there. But two, and what kept, what really stuck with me was that it didn't need to be an online moment at all. Like nothing had happened. There was no violence. There was no actual confrontation. Like some people yelled at each other at a protest outside of, welcome to DC, right? This happens all the time, and you don't need to take that and to sort of like turn it into an outrage moment on the internet, was just, I just felt like, oh God, here we are again. Like we're just going to have to keep doing this over and over and over again. The idea of, the image, the spectacle, right? This is the thing that we're going to pay attention to. And everybody's going to be entirely consumed by it for an entire day. Well, there were lawsuits fought over that, by the way. There were like multiple defamation cases. I think some settled, some were dismissed. This was it actually had like pretty significant repercussions for the kid who was a teenager. It was a mess.
Well, there's this impulse that you're like the world is falling apart. Crazy things are happening. I don't like this. And that by yelling about it on the internet, you're affecting the situation in some way, which you are fundamentally not doing. Right. And you do get this sense that there are people who feel very politically active and engaged, but they are active and engaged not in the donation of money, not in the volunteering of time, not in running or operating political parties, and not even in voting. But just in talking about the thing a lot, as if that's like, which is really just sort of mob action. And so it feels so minor to say, but like responding to comments on the internet is not only not your job, it's not contributing positive or negative to the situation in any way. The only thing you're doing is benefiting like these social media companies that sit in between us and like our dissatisfaction with the world, the levers of power. Then there's like social media companies in between that go like, let me just channel that energy for you. And by the time it gets here, it's very weak because you spent all your time arguing with these people who, again, may or may not even exist, to say nothing of whether they're representative of, public opinion. And so you spend all this time talking on the internet, and then I think they call this the narcotizing dysfunction. You feel like you are a hero of the Republic, and you're in fact the opposite of a hero of the Republic. You're not doing the things you could be doing. You're just using up a lot of time on the computer.
There was that term like slacktivism. I feel like that was around the time that you were writing your book, actually. Whereas I don't think you hear it mentioned quite so much anymore. Now it is seen as this interesting shift, right? What does galvanize action? Because you do see online activity coming to galvanize real life action, right? And I do talk about that. There's some some pretty significant moments. January 6th, of course, is one, right, where you do see the sort of like the connection between.
Of course.
Yeah. So there is there's a progression, like a pipeline for it to happen. But in those moments online, there's that sort of the sort of roiling outrage machine. I think this is where the appeal of the sort of Marcus Aurelius quote was just the idea that you actually can check out. Like you really don't have to weigh in. It's kind of a freeing experience when you realize that the world doesn't need your take,
Yes. Well, the Marcus Aurelius quote that I have been thinking a lot about pertaining to what you write about, and then obviously the pandemic, he was writing during the Antonine Plague. Yeah. And he talks about, he's like, look, there's actually two types of plagues. He's like, there's the virus version where you get it and it can make you sick and it can kill you. And then he's like, there's this other plague you can get that can like destroy your character. And I think it's been so interesting to watch. Most of us don't have long COVID, but there's other people that have like long internet COVID. Like, do you know what I mean? Like they are still living in a world something touched them. And you could say it's on both ends of the spectrum, but it's really on one end of the spectrum, where now their entire worldview has flipped, their values have flipped, their like circle of influence and people that they're interested in is now defined from this thing they picked up in June of 2020 because they saw a blog post or a Facebook post or someone sent them this weird YouTube video. And it's fascinating to watch someone just get taken over by this like idea virus.
And it has lasting, one of the things that becomes interesting, some of the people that I try to trace through the book were influential in 2015. You know, I was so for those who don't know, I was like a mom activist in California I had my first baby in 2013, and in 2014 was the Disneyland measles outbreak, right? And I'd come from New York to California, and I was like, what is wrong with this state?
This is crazy, of course.
Because they had this thing called the personal belief exemption, where you could just decide that you were not going to get your kid a measles vaccine, and like everybody was supposed to be okay with that. Like you had just made that determination, and I thought, like, we live in a society. How does this work? This was very foreign to me as a New Yorker, as a transplant, where you don't have like that type of exemption. Simply didn't exist, right? You had a medical exemption, or you had a religious exemption, and if you were religious, you had to actually prove that you were religious. You couldn't just find faith like in relation to vaccines. You had to have it in other capacities. And as I was, and I got very involved in like, how do we improve vaccination rates in California schools? Because I was sending my kid to public kindergarten, right? He was going to go to public kindergarten, and he was a baby. So this was my sort of like long-term plan, was to try to help improve that. And some of the people that we're writing about and talking about in 2015 their influence grows massively between 2015 and COVID. And by the time COVID is ready, by the time COVID happens, like they already have an incredible organizing infrastructure. They have massive numbers of followers. They have been, speaking about how the measles vaccine gives you autism and all of these other things for now the better part of half a decade online, right? And meanwhile, the CDC has done absolutely nothing between these two events to in any way shift or modernize its communication. Again, these are just some people online. And I thought, this is going to be an absolute disaster. This is going to be an absolute mess. Before the virus even made it to American soil, anti-vaccine activists in December 2020 and that would have been December 2019 and January 2020, are out there making videos about how this is really great for us, guys. They're going to rush through a vaccine, and we're going to finally be able to tell the people like what they've ignored all along with these polio and measles vaccines. And so it was very much they really saw the moment. They had the organizing infrastructure, and they went for it. And what I thought was so fascinating about that, I followed these characters, the sort of evolution over the years, the amassing of more and more influence as people become deeply entrenched in factions. But what you also start to see is people who have never talked about that topic begin to migrate their content to that topic, because all of a sudden that's what people are doom scrolling about. That's what people are looking for. And so all of a sudden now you might have been, a standard political influencer, but here is the thing that you're going to talk about now. You might have been a sports influencer, but you can talk about vaccines and sports, And so all of a sudden you have this topic, and what you start to see is like just the pivoting of content to where the attention locus is. And it's not that they have any even, I would argue, significant, there's interest in the topic, but it's not that they want to become experts in it. It's just that they're really able to galvanize, to capitalize on that attention. And so you see the sort of pivoting, like all things become COVID. Yes. And then as the pandemic, as people return to normal life, now 2-3 years later, what you do start to see is again, some of them they have long COVID, or they had some sort of significant issue with a vaccine or whatever, and there is like a personal reason to do that. But it is the migration of the so-called COVID influencers as they're moving back into politics. We have an election, right? That's what they're going to talk about now. There is, whatever abortion rights becomes a thing briefly in there. You have you see them basically just like migrate to whatever the outrage of the day is, and the culture war just becomes a constant stream of like, I will pivot my content to talk about this, and this, so I can maintain that energy, maintain that attention, not because I even have necessarily a deeply, sincerely held viewpoint or expertise or whatever, but just...
Well, it's a weird combination of supply and demand.
Yeah.
So there are bases, like there is this sort of latent belief in an idea. And then there's also the I am an influencer, and thus I have to create large amounts of content to keep my machine operational.
Right.
And so it's like, who is leading who? It's this fascinating thing. And I think they're kind of, I would maybe argue there's like two different types of influencers. There's someone who's like really into a specific thing, and they love that thing and they know that thing and that's what they talk about. And then there's people who are sort of attracted to influence itself. Like, I want to have attention. I need to have an audience. I need to be important. I'm gravitating towards the energy of being popular and important. And I think we've kind of watched now that the space has existed for a while. You see there's like the people who are like, this is what I do, so I talk about it, whether it's popular or unpopular. And then there's a group of people who they go, well, how do I go over here? How do I go over here? And you kind of watch. That's what I mean, where you sort of watch them get infected with a version of a virus where like they were, you talk about like the guitar guy in the book. He's like a guitarist, but he's not that popular. And then he touches a trending topic, or the trending topic touches him. Right. And then finally it's like he gets the thing he's always wanted. Like the virus finds the host. and the host is like the hunger for attention and fame and the love of like surfing that. Right. And then so now he's like, that's my thing. Yeah. Like, do you know who J.P. Sears is?
Yes, I do.
Fascinating case.
Fascinating case. I remembered his stuff.
You could not have made up that story, by the way. It's so preposterous.
It is a wild story. I remembered him when he made fun of like lefty things, right? Yes. And I lived in California, but I was always like a New Yorker. Yeah. And the sort of like, mocking the sort of hippie yoga culture and stuff like that. And I was like, this is actually very, very funny. But then it becomes kind of like pointed and it gets meaner, right? And you do see that it stops being and I don't mean that it stopped being funny in that it started making fun of something I liked. It wasn't like I am having a defensive reaction to this. I just thought like it's just not funny anymore. Because it crossed from being satire and making fun of excess to what felt like a much more I am attacking a political opponent. But I don't know, maybe you can put your finger on it better than I can, because it was just
what I think happened is he was sort of the culture he was making fun of before. So like health and wellness culture, right? And he sort of knows all these people, and he gets it. His diet's not that different than the people he's making fun of, but he gets the absurdity of it, right? There's a self-awareness to the criticism. And then what I understand happens is he's also, I mean, you can't make a living doing that. He's basically like a low-level, like regional stand-up comic. Right. So the lockdowns happen, and now he can't perform in these clubs. Yep. So now this thing has touched him personally, and he makes something. This makes him angry, and he talks about it or writes about it or whatever. He puts a piece of content out in the world that is about this thing that he doesn't normally talk about, and then that becomes popular in a way that none of the other things had, or becomes popular in a way that's new and fresh and different, and then. If you're the person who is just like, I do what's that becomes you, right? Now you're like, you go to where you're getting traction, you go to where there's getting attention, and then you're going towards it, it's also coming towards you, and it consumes you and it changes you. And I think what's different about it now is the things he's making fun of or criticizing or talking about are him attacking other people. So it goes from that's
true, I think.
And it becomes it's just funny. You couldn't have scripted a person. It's the greatest illustration I've ever seen of the horseshoe theory, right? You have him over here making content, and then he goes all the way around and becomes the very same thing, but for different reasons. Yeah. And arguably becomes much more popular as a result. And so it's this strange thing that you watch happen. And I've just seen it happen. So you're like, you're over here and now you're over here. What changed? And you just watch someone get consumed and become almost unrecognizable.
Did he wind up selling supplements also? Doesn't he?
Of course.
Yeah, I mean,
sure.
I feel like the supplements are always the red flag.
Well, ultimately, I think that's an interesting part, which I'm not immune to, is you think about, okay, so people acquire these audiences, and then to monetize an audience almost always requires a very high margin product.
So supplements are it.
And supplements are a very high margin product by definition, because there's not very much in them and they're worth a lot to people. So you tend to see certain things go into those spaces. This is why like Fox News is always like reverse mortgages or gold. It's a certain, you can often tell something about the quality of the product from the type of advertising or sponsorship that's in that space.
Yes. There's, I spend a lot of time for my job on every social platform, and Truth Social is by far the one with like the absolute most bizarre ads.
Yes.
I mean, it's like diabetes scams and stuff like that. Like, it's actually kind of sad, actually. It's a reflection of like what you might call like grade A advertisers are not there. And so you have this sort of weird collection of products that are geared to the sort of demographic, but a lot of them are actually borderline scams. My feeling with the supplements thing is there was a great article, and I'm trying to remember who wrote it. It was years ago, and it was pointing out that like Gwyneth Paltrow and Alex Jones used the exact same sort of supplement culture, right?
Yeah.
Brain Force, whatever, and she had some like hippie name for it, and this that spectrum.
Well, I think the supplements thing is interesting because it probably should be something that's regulated, and it's just not. Right. And because it's not, there's high margins in it. But what I've come to understand is that the scammy advertisers is a feature, not a bug of the site. So like, I was reading something once about like Nigerian scammers. So, you get the thing.
Totally.
Like, you and I read it and you go, this is obvious nonsense. This is no Nigerian prince would ever email. They'd never type this way. And the point is, it's supposed to generate that reaction in us.
Right.
Because we would waste that person's time.
Right.
We would, even if we replied, we'd eventually realize, oh, this is not how things work. I'm not going to do this. And so the thing is trying to select out it's trying to select for credulous people, right? And it's trying to select out incredulous people. And you realize, oh yeah, the purpose of a lot of these ecosystems or things is to get the gullible people in one place, because then you can sell them stuff, whether it's political ideas or whether it's certain sponsorships or scams like that. It's trying to herd people into different audiences, and you realize, oh, there's like, it's trying to, the content and the advertising are of similar quality. Yeah. And that's what's happening. And so if you're reading something or consuming something, you go, what are these garbage ads? You should probably go like, oh, that's actually a helpful signal.
It is. We see them on, there's all these AI generated content farms now, right? This is the sort of new, you always see like propaganda evolves for whatever the technological architecture of the day is. And so tons of what I look at now is just AI generated content farms. And it's like the Macedonian teenagers of 2016, right? Yeah. Where the entire point of a lot of the fake news, so to speak, of 2016 was designed to just push people to heavily ad laden sites. That's how they were making their money. They actually didn't care ideologically who they were writing about. They just felt that like this particular audience was more of a mark, and that was what was going to get them their revenue. And what you see now with the AI generated content sites is very much this. It's the same kind of like pushing out content to try to make people click to a site, and then you see the entire thing is created by machines laden with ads, and it is a red flag, I think, when you see that kind of stuff. I
would be curious your thoughts on podcasting as a medium, because I had such high hopes for it as a medium, and like it wasn't like sort of it seemed to be when I was writing the updated version of Trust Me I'm Lying, I was talking about podcasting as a positive medium in that it's subscriber based, like instead of just like random viral things. Like audio is not super viral, or it wasn't then. It's long form, so it's not like Twitter then being like 140 characters where it's trying to like shorten and strip things of nuance. Like I think it's wonderful for people to have a 2-hour conversation. And then also from an advertising medium, it's sort of sponsorships up front, not this kind of real time, like however many page views you get, you monetize that many ads. Yeah. I thought it was going to be somewhat immune from the consequences or the toxic incentives that have kind of ruined those first generation of media things. And now I'm more and more convinced that, like, as you said, you look at the 2016 election, you think content farms, you think Facebook advertising and targeting, these being and then bots being the sort of source of the disinformation that kind of broke the country's brain in this pivotal moment. When I look at 2020 through now, I'm actually thinking podcasts are the root of so much of it in a way that I wouldn't have anticipated.
I think, it's different, I guess would be my answer, which maybe is not satisfying, but it's the same thing as like the argument you're making is the same argument for like newsletters, right? This is the argument that the Substack guys have made. And I really like them. I think they're,
there's always some invention that's going to improve it. And actually it's not.
Right. Well, because the question is like, what is the bad thing, right? And I think people really want there to be one bad thing. And so for a long time, you talk about, and I did this too in 2017. Oh, my rather simplistic diagnosis of the world then was like, oh, it's the advertising-based business model.
Yes.
It's the targetability. Now, the targetability on a centralized platform is, like, it does have the impact of pushing people into silos. Like,
Sure.
It just does. And that's because everything is curated and your attention is finite and the platform wants you there and not on another platform. And this is the dynamic that determines the curation in your feed, right? And so you do see, Substack and other folks being like, okay, well, now we're going to move to subscription models. But I do think that then you have a very different type of audience capture, right? Where that the audience is there, like this, becomes your livelihood for a lot of people, right? And podcasting is, I think, the same thing. You have your audience, you want to keep your audience there. And so telling your audience what they don't want to hear is not necessarily the best path to maintaining that audience and to good, to continuing good business. I think you may have an audience, like you, I think probably do, right? That prizes sort of reflectivity and nuance and things like that. But that's also because that's the community that you've curated, right? So ultimately, I think what it does come down to is I'm trying to remember who said it, like the phrase, like the problem with social media is people.
Yes. Yeah.
But it is that, it is in fact that, right? It's the human nature of like, we might like to hear more of what we want to hear, and whether that's an advertising based, kind of model that leads to particular curation mechanisms and, structuring of a feed. But when people are then kind of committing their capital, right? Like subscribing to or patronizing a person, unless that person is really doing I think is really prioritizing not telling them what they want to hear, you do see that audience capture phenomenon beginning to start. And it's very siloed. That's the other thing I'll say, which is podcasts, sometimes it's hard to know what has been said, right? So on social media, everything's largely out there in the open unless it's happening in some closed group.
Yeah.
And more things do happen in closed groups because people don't want the visibility of having public conversations now. They know the internet might come for them, and that's scary. Podcasts, I think, I'm like, with like a finite number of hours in the day, sometimes I'm like, can I find a transcript of this?
Yeah.
I'd like to read that conversation where I can digest it in 5 minutes as opposed to 2 hours. Or Substack, where it's actually paywalled, right? Where I'm like, okay, what happens below the fold? I don't know.
Yeah.
And it's a different form of engaging the intersection between attention, monetization, and human nature. So I don't know that I say it's like better or worse. I think that, again, the idea that it eliminates the bad side of tribalism or the other ideas that, very idealistic people put forth, I don't think that's true. I think it just manifests differently. Yeah,
the problem with media is people. It's like there is no fake news. We're the fake news, basically. But what I think is interesting with podcasts, and I guess this is true for all the mediums, and what I was trying to say in my book, and I think you say it well in yours, is like, the problem is also wherever there are people, there are going to be bad actors that try to shape or direct those people, right? I think what you find is that the kooks or the ideologues or the people with an agenda figure out the tools first and fastest and most effectively. So it's like, I thought podcasts would be this awesome thing, and they are this awesome thing, but then you're watching, people who can have access to legacy media, that I'm talking like politicians, leaders, companies, they're fine. The system's working for them.
Yeah.
And so it's the people who have the crazy ideas that have to go towards the new medium with the least resistance. And so like for instance, I got invited to this this thing that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was doing, where it was like what I deduced is he's clearly flying around the country and having podcasting dinners where he has like a dinner, and then he invites the podcasters who live in that town to come. You have to pay. So he's raising money. And then what he's doing is he's seeding ideas to these people who are going to then go back to their audience.
Right.
And then some percentage of them will also have him on. And I'm like, it was just fascinating to me. Okay, yeah, here's this person who he's finding the media outlets that are being neglected by the bigger candidates or the people who have the ideas, who have public platforms in some way, are not thinking, hey, how do I get out and talk on every single platform to get these ideas out there? And so you end up seeding the field, and then these people dominate those spaces. He's the master influencer. He's probably
he's very good. He's very good at what he does.
He made like $8 million last year, like as an influence grifter. And I think it's fascinating.
This was the, my frustration was, we dealt with him in 2015 during that law I wanted to get passed in California, right? And, and we had very particular ways of dealing with it just as like activist moms, which was like, well, we're going to mock the shit out of this actually, right? And it was, kind of fascinating to watch. Media generally will write like debunking articles. I was actually reading one on my way over here. They sort of dredge up some controversy from the past or something. Yeah. But what I think they don't necessarily understand is like they're speaking to the choir at that point, right? Yes. The people who are reading the Daily Beast are going to nod along and be like, yes, totally. But it's not actually reaching the base. It's not showing up there in that conversation. So it's different conversations happening in completely different places. What you said about the people who uncover things first. So I study what we call adversarial abuse online, right? And the adversary varies, but inevitably the first people to pull in and use new and novel technology are spammers and scammers. 100% of the time. When people are talking about generative AI and being very afraid of like the political implications, I'm like, it's actually the spammers and scammers who've been on it, right? That's what you see all over Facebook. Like it's documented. These are people who are like, I can take my cost to operate down. I can improve my margins. I can reach new people. I can do things where the rules haven't been written yet. And so you see it there first, and then you do see the thing that was interesting, and you're absolutely correct about this. People who don't have access to major media spaces have also always been early adopters of social media because it is so user created, right? Yeah. We all have the power to say whatever we want at this point, and you see this reflected also in how institutions react, which is, like I said, dealing with RFK Jr. in 2015, and this vaccine law in California we wanted to pass. He continued to build a social media following over the years. Platforms struggled to figure out what to do about that, right? Where you actually see him starting to get, starting to raise hackles is during the Samoa measles outbreak of 2019. So it's actually pre-COVID, where about 85 kids died in that outbreak. And this is where you see the platforms begin to realize that Children's Health Defense and some of the other organizations, Children's Health Defense was absolutely instrumental in the propaganda around measles vaccines in Samoa because there was a terrible accident in which nurses had mixed a vial of a vaccine, not with water, but with some sort of muscle relaxant, and 2 kids died from a vaccine in Samoa, leading to the government halting the program. As they tried to figure out what had happened. They didn't realize that this was a nurse accident at the time. And Children's Health Defense is beating the drum about the measles vaccine killing kids and goes on and on and on. And as the result of the finding becomes apparent, they never communicate to their audience that this is what actually happened, that this was a horrible medical accident. And instead, they just continue to propagate, that type of fear and suspicion. And so you see this, you see the role that they play in these moments, like, again, having the sort of real world impact as all of a sudden there's a measles outbreak in Samoa about a year after the program's halted, and they institute a mandatory vaccine campaign because literally 85 children have died or are dying at the time. And these are kids under 5, right? And so you see the government trying to, to emergency vaccinate kids with, little kids. And the same audiences are out there attacking the government of Samoa on its Facebook page saying, no, it's the vaccine that caused the outbreak. No, it's the vaccine that's killing the kids. And again, this is long prior to COVID. Then you see Facebook trying to figure out, okay, what do we do about this now, right? And you start to see them trying to react. But it is that you don't see... So they have really dominated the social media ecosystem. They are the best at getting their message out. And then you see the government kind of putting out its statements and quotes in the media, on television. They don't have that networked infrastructure. Nothing that they say is going viral. So it's a completely different playing field. And you see this happen over and over and over again, where the institution thinks like, oh, well, we're just going to get our message out in the Washington Post,
Yes.
and then people are going to believe us, and everything is going to go back to normal. And they don't realize that sort of like, people get invested when they participate is the other thing, right? And that's why when people are participating, as much as we might joke around about it being slacktivism or not actually having an impact, for them, it's having an impact, right? It's giving them the satisfaction.
Thing in their life.
It is a thing that they feel that they are able to do. They may not have any power to make a change in the real world, but here online they can. And so it provides them with that that desire to feel like they're doing something. And this dynamic that's happening over here on the internet versus like the occasional pronouncements from on high in the media are two completely different ways of communicating. And, you know, ordinary people are spending their time over here now.
And that influence that they accumulate online becomes its own sort of currency or form of power, right? So I think I've been fascinated with friends of mine who will platform some of these people. And I know they don't actually think this or are not outright crazy. Maybe they're flirting with it, but they go, this person has a big audience, right? And so there's this kind of, like when everyone's kind of an influencer and they're not thinking, hey, what's true or not, or what do I believe or not, or what are my responsibilities or not? They're thinking, will this do well? Will this generate a reaction? So everyone's kind of this like weird professional wrestler, not doing professional wrestling, but like real consequences are a result of this. And it's hard to figure out the best way to communicate to people like, this is real and it matters and it has consequences.
Yeah. And also it does, you know, you do have the, you know, for a while, I spent a lot of time actually trying to talk to conservative podcasters, right? Yeah. And I like them. I like arguing. I think it's fun. You know, I have no problem doing it. What was always funny to me about it was like, you would get shit from like the liberals who followed you that you had gone on there to even do it, right?
Yeah.
Why? And it just turned into like, you know, you had to stay within the bounds of of who your kind of core group found acceptable. And if you deviated from that, if you did, you know, left, went on far left, you know, I sort of identify as center left roughly, you would go on far left and then you would get shit, or you would go on right and you would get shit, you know, and so you just found yourself in this position of like, okay, but there's this very narrow space where I can talk and we're going to nod along with each other and we're not going to get anywhere. But what is the value of going and doing those other things? Like, I feel like it's actually quite high. It just becomes a question of, you know, you see these little network graphs sometimes being made of so-and-so talked to so-and-so who talked to so-and-so, and then through the transitive property, like you naturally absorb all of their opinions or something, you know. And it's kind of exhausting, actually. I don't know what you do to break out of that, sort of just saying like, well, okay, I'm just going to keep doing it. But
isn't that a big part of it, right? So like, part of the act that they're so good at is like they say absolutely crazy things or absolutely dangerous things. Like if this were to, you know, they'll say something, and then like you or me or someone will knows this person, then we like you go, hey, I want to go talk to that audience. So you go on the podcast, and then while you're there, they seem reasonable and they seem nice. And you want to be polite, right? And so there is also this, I think one of the insidious parts about it is these people become sort of very radicalized, have absolutely abhorrent ideas that are directly responsible, not just for like the collapse of, you know, sort of trust in institutions or the, you know, certain policies, but like kids die because of what you're talking about, right? Yeah. And then you know the person who's saying these things, right? You know them, or they're friendly, they're personable, and then so there's this kind of reluctance to like call a spade in person directly, and I've felt it myself. But the result is it kind of normalizes it. Like part of what they're doing is using personal relationships and the appearance of reasonability to shield the significance of what they're saying or they're advocating for or what they're doing, and normalizing that. They're exploiting the personal connection to not be ostracized, which is what they should be. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think that question of, how do you engage? I think the other piece of it, though, is how do you engage if you want to try to maybe kind of like pull someone back in a sense.
I was going to ask
right?
you about this. Yes.
And I don't know. I really don't. I mean, you've been in the public eye and visible for a very, very long time, and you write books teaching people how to think about that from a philosophical standpoint. I don't. I mean, I feel like a lot of what I do is I like chronicle the decline of the Republic without necessarily having as much of a sense of how do you fix it? You mentioned early on, like when you become the character, right? And for me, that was like a wild experience of, all right, can I use this in a way almost to, maybe this is like my next book, right? How do you respond? How do you, what are the ways in which, to what extent can you pull people back? I remember there was a person who I've known for a very long time, and we were actually in a DM group all through COVID, right? And as the weird conspiracy theories about my work started, he wrote this article and he included the sentence like, "Who is Renée DiResta?" And I was like, are you fucking kidding me?
Yeah. What are you talking about?
What are you talking about? We've been in a DM group for 3 years. Yeah. You know exactly who I am. Yeah. In fact, we were in a DM group all through the 2020 election, all through COVID. Like, I have, the idea that like this like who is nonsense. Like that actually I felt was like, that was the most outraged I've been throughout half of this, because I felt like, okay, when it's some right-wing rando doing it, I get it, right? It's wrestling. We're all in it. It's a contact sport. You're going to send me some stupid media request. I'm going to front run it. We're going to get our, this is how we're going to play the game. Like, fine, I understand. I'm not naive. But when it comes from somebody who actually knows you, that was where I was like, okay, this is absolutely inexcusable. And I actually really didn't know, how the hell do I respond to that one? Yeah.
How did you respond?
I sent an outraged message into the group chat first. Sure. I was like, I'm not even going to pretend this doesn't bother me. Like, this actually bothers me a lot, because it felt like a betrayal in a sense, right? And it felt like a betrayal for the most like meaningless internet points. Mm-hmm. Like, what are you going to get? You're getting a momentary boost from this, right? Rather than saying like, I know her, I'll have her on, let's ask her questions or something along those lines. It just turned into like, I'm going to pretend that we don't even have a relationship and mine this moment for content. Yeah. And I just found it just so disappointing also on okay, I guess you're really not who I thought you were. Like, what a disappointment this is. And I made some this was actually at a time when I was trying to deal with my institution not wanting me to say anything, right? And this is where your point about like, you think that there are adults in the room, right? And so I'm like, okay, well, the comms people, like, surely they know what they're doing. And this is like the, that sort of thing that happens where even though you've watched failure happen a million times in a million different ways with institutional comms, you feel like maybe this time it's different, and it's not. But you still kind of delude yourself momentarily into thinking it will be. And so I really said nothing for a very long time, actually. And so as this was happening, I was like, am I going to get in trouble for calling attention to it, right? Am I going to have to deal with somebody being mad at me for raising it? And then what do I get by raising it? Like, do I get like my side outraged at him? Does that serve me really? And I just felt sort of paralyzed, I guess is the word, by the question of like, what do you do in that moment? Because again, when it's regular media, the game is clear, right? We all know what's going to happen. We all know how we're going to play. The rules of engagement are very clear. But when it's that sort of thing, I thought like, do I want to be in this back and forth? Do I want like, I can get some internet support. I can get a couple thousand likes on this dunk, that sort of thing. But like, what does that actually get me? I don't know that. Right. I don't know that it gets me anything. And so I think I made some like kind of, half-hearted post on Blue Sky or something at the time. And then really just like, raged about it in a DM group with friends for an hour, and that was the end of it.
What do you do? What do you do when someone sends you something that's like obviously nuts or weird, or like I go back and forth on that. Sometimes I ignore it. Sometimes I try to point by point explain it. Sometimes I respond in frustration. But this is like what you do about it systemically or globally. It's probably nothing because we may just be fucked. But interactions between
one-on-one,
intellectuals.
I think it works.
So what works best? How do you extinguish crazy?
I don't know you extinguish it necessarily, but I'll do more of like a, hey, I've done it both directions. Sometimes it's sent to me, like, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? Sometimes, and this happened actually quite a bit during COVID. Again, like we were all I don't know if you guys are like this too, but we're all in the DMs, right? Yeah. Everybody had like WhatsApp groups at this point, Clubhouse groups, that kind of thing. And I had one person where, we sort of maybe ideologically agreed like 25% of the time as a baseline. But again, these were like very ideologically diverse friend groups. It was never an issue. But what he would periodically send was things where he'd be absolutely like mad with outrage about something. Like, how do you not speak out against this? Don't you think this is crazy? Don't you think this is terrible? And sometimes it was like, maybe on DEI or race or trans or like pick your culture war topic, abortion sometimes. And I would say like, you have to understand, like, I don't even see this. Like, this is so squarely in like your little bubble that that you are the first person who has even shown me that this is a moment of outrage on the internet. Yeah. Like
this exists only to you.
Exactly. And so I would try to point out, I can send you 30 things that you've probably never seen that, the center left is extremely upset about right now today. And, and you'll see then maybe that we're not even having a conversation at this point. Like you think that I should be speaking out against this thing that I do not even see. And then other times it would be like actually engaging on the merits, right? Yeah. Which is, okay, let's have a conversation about this, like good faith conversation on the merits. Here's why I think this is ridiculous. Here's why I think this sourcing is wrong. Here's how. Sometimes what I do is I've actually found that sometimes pointing out the weasel words is actually a more effective way of responding. Yeah. So like I'm not going to debunk and fact check every point in this 4,000 word article. What I am going to say is like, look how often the word they is used. Look how often the word linked to or the phrase linked to appears. Like what is linked to? Yeah, maybe. And I think I didn't start to, again, for me, this was sort of like a personal experience when I would watch how people would write around the thing that they wanted to say about me, right? Yeah. I remember getting one media inquiry that was literally like, I was moderating a panel for the Obama Foundation's, some Obama Foundation conference. Moderating, I didn't pick my panelists. Yeah. They were assigned to me. I was just asked to go there and ask them questions and have a dialogue. And Nicole Hannah-Jones was one of the people on the panel at the 1619 Project. I am not particularly ideologically aligned with everything Nicole Hannah-Jones says, but it's not my job as a moderator to be. It's to have a conversation, right? Yeah, this is why I'm there, right? And right-wing media reaches out with this inquiry that's like, we're going to write that you are, we're writing that you're moderating this panel. And again, you start to see the article comes out, we need a comment on that you're moderating the panel. And I was like, what do you want me to comment on? Like, do you want me to explain what a panel is or what moderating is? Like, what is the thing I'm being asked to comment on here? And then, of course, it turns into like, is linked to, right? DiResta, comma, who is linked to. And then, it's just this transitive property of bad people. They just want to get a constellation of people that are boogeymen in that media ecosystem. And of course, Nicole Hannah-Jones has a million also. And so it's this article about literally like the panel hadn't even happened yet. There was not even anything to write that was objectionable related to the conversation or anything she or I said. It was merely the fact that two people that they did not like were going to be on stage at the same time at an event put on by a president that they do not like. Yeah. And so this was like catnip. And I just thought like it's incredible to me that this is going to be a news article. And when you see these stories happen, when you see when you know what is real versus you see these weasel words that are, linked to, connected with, literally like you're on a podcast with another person, you're linked to them then at that point, and this is how the sausage is made. And I kind of like what you describe in your book, actually, is I've been more on a kick of like, can I explain how the sausage is made, right?
Yeah.
I'll screenshot the email. Here's the inquiry I got.
Yes.
Here's what I sent back. Here's the article that came out. Let's talk about what just happened here, right?
Sure.
I'm not going to bother refuting the points in the article. It's a waste of my time. It's a waste of your time to read that, because the entire point is that this is a spectacle, and let me explain to you like how the construct of the spectacle actually works. So that's how I've chosen to respond a lot of the time. Only one-on-one will I get into conversations about the merits at this point.
Yeah.
And that's because a lot of the time it is, some of it is facts, but some of it is values. What is the, how do I weight this piece of information? Like the information might be the same, but how we choose to weight it, what we choose to prioritize is different. And that's where I feel like those conversations are better in small groups.
Yeah, I've been struggling with as I know a lot of these people because they weren't crazy not that long ago. And some cases I've done business with them. In some cases we're friends. They've been to my house. I've been to their house. And then this tension of like, okay, well, what I think they're doing is abhorrent. I think they've not just lost the thread. I think something's wrong, something's happened in their brain. And the tension between ignoring, as we said, we don't have to have an opinion. They're not me. I don't control what they do. And one's obligation when that story about the emperor having no clothes. I think a lot of the misinformation we have is a result of people who are not well, in some cases, just sort of being not well publicly on the internet. And then other people not wanting to pick on that person, other people not wanting to call that person out, other people not wanting the hassle of their crazy fans being on them.
I think that's actually a big part of it.
Yeah. And so you're just like, so we're just going to sit here and watch this person spin off into delusions and insanity, even though we know that some people are not recognizing, some members of the audience are not recognizing what's happening and making real consequential decisions based on this information. I go back and forth as to what the proper response to that is.
I think it is actually that concern or the question of is it worth dealing with the crazy crowd?
Yeah.
Is a huge, huge part of it. And that's where, as much as you can talk about bridging divides in real life, and there are a lot of great groups that are doing this. Better Angels is one of them. There's a few of them that are trying to say how can you reduce the belief that your political opposition is actually an enemy in a we must vanquish them kind of sense of the word. When it happens online, you are really committing to a day at minimum of being barraged by people, and that does become it has a significant chilling effect, actually.
Yes.
And that's where I think the question of, we talk about counter speech. I mean, I do in the book too, right? How do you have effective counter speech? The cost of counter speaking is real.
Yes. And they make it higher on purpose.
Yes, exactly. And that is where I don't know what the answer is. I think this is where, as I think about, I went into academia in 2019. I don't have a PhD.
Yeah.
It's not it was sort of something I kind of found myself in a bit accidentally. But when I think about, what kind of research needs to be done, it is that question of what can you do to create that counter speech? Because otherwise, nobody wants to have that debate. Nobody wants to challenge that idea. I mean, I'm barely on Twitter. I used to be on Twitter 24/7. That was my platform, right? And then after getting, after dealing with lunatics, I was just I'm just going to lock it down and I can say what I want to say on these 7 other platforms. But I also know that I am, to an extent, kind of preaching to the choir when I do that, right? And so...
there's something, it's there's good sense in saying, hey, I'm not going to talk about this thing. I'm not going to wade into this discussion because I don't want the hassle of these lunatics, and it's probably not going to make a big difference. And then there's also something that's cowardly is the wrong word, but it's this tension between sanity and good sense and sort of obligation and responsibility and justice.
Right.
And I don't always know how to make that balance. And I think your point of just like, hey, I'm just gonna say what I think is true. And maybe that's actually the way to do it, is like, instead of thinking as it sort of speech, counter speech, like someone over here is wrong on the internet, so I must let them know that they're wrong on the internet.
Right.
Maybe the proper response is, hey, let's get better at being right on the internet.
Yeah.
And more effective at communicating what's right on the internet. Like you could argue that maybe it was always a lost cause for the CDC in the pandemic to like convince anti-vaxxers that they were nonsense. But you know what they could have done? They could have more effectively communicated
Absolutely.
the pro-vaccine message or any of the safety protocols during the COVID. And they did a horrendously bad job of the thing that was entirely in their control.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like
Totally.
you can focus on, hey, how do I beat these people at their own game? And you're probably never going to reason people out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. But you can reason the people who are asking for the information into the right position. And so maybe that's just the methodology. It's like, how do you just get more effective at communicating truth as you understand it and not see it as a contentious sort of discussion? Because like, you probably shouldn't be talking to these people at all. You're liable to get infected by talking to them, you know?
I think it's you know, this was actually our view on it during the vaccine law fight, where we had, you know, it was like a bunch of mom and, you know, some dad volunteers, and we were like, we're not going to convince the true believers to believe something different. We're here to reach the people who are on the fence or who have never heard of this bill that we want to pass or who have never thought about this idea, and we're going to do everything that we can to reach them. And that translated into, like, you know, we would not get into debates in the comments section of our Facebook page.
Yes.
It was not worth the time. There was a finite amount of energy, and we were going to just continue to post our message. And this was like very small scale activism, but I think it is the right instinct, I think, in a way. And I've been, I really want to meet more comms people who do this professionally, where I'm like, what is it? You know, I'm fascinated by the field of like crisis comms and things at this point, where I'm like, how do you think about that? Like, what is it you do now?
This is gonna sound,
what are best practices?
It's going to sound mean, but one of the realities that I have figured out the hard way is, if you were good at comms, you probably wouldn't have a comms job.
Right.
You would
I think you say this in the book too.
You would have your own comms agency. And so there is something, it's fundamentally unfair, right? Because you're having basically employed bureaucrats fighting against entrepreneurs. Even if these entrepreneurs over here are nuts, the economics are fundamentally different. One has potentially can make millions of dollars. One, whether they do a good job or a bad job, is only going to make their salary.
Yeah.
And so there, it's sort of a mismatched fight. But I think, I don't know, just being able to effectively communicate is a skill that not enough people have. And crazy people care so much that they accidentally get good at it.
I think it's also, you probably see this, I feel like it's the rhetoric piece.
Yeah.
Do you ever, I started going back and literally reading like rhetoric textbooks and propaganda textbooks and just being like, this is very old art, you know?
Very old, sure. Yeah, you start with Renée. It's like Renée's figured this stuff out.
Right, in the 1920s.
Yes.
Yeah, and even before that, you know, hundreds of years before, you have, you have people in ancient
demagogues are not new.
Right, demagogues are not new. So this question of, reading old rhetoric books and things like this, and just looking at what are the ways in which the communication works. And in the age of the internet, it is, what is the thing that is going to make this go viral?
Yeah.
Right. And I spend a lot of time looking at that, even in my own feed, right? Where I'm like, why did this post, not even written by me, just more like, why did this post, why did it do well? Yeah. And it's either, sometimes it's just pure positivity, right? I do think that people are really like, oh my God, you know, this is why people love cats, right? It is just that, like, here is like a heartwarming, wholesome story, and it's fantastic that I'm seeing this on the internet, because I never see this. I always see like hate and rage. So there's the pure positivity, or there's the like, I am going to explain a thing that I have some sort of deep expertise in. I'm going to break it down, and you're going to get like 3 tweets. And then I think there's like a feeling of like, okay, I've just learned something. Like there's an appreciation there. But then the last part is really like, here is my moral outrage, right? Here is my, and you see this a lot. It's the, it's indignation. I think indignation really, really works.
It's a powerful, high valence emotion.
Yeah.
Well, I've seen this with what I do, right? So, like, I'm not academically trained in ancient philosophy in any way, and I've written these books. I'm now associated with this thing. And so sometimes people will go, well, he's not as smart as so-and-so, or he's not as qualified as so-and-so. This person writes about it better. And there, I think sometimes there can be some resentment from academics that like my books are more popular than someone who's studied this thing for 50 years. And I sort of go, I mean, have at it, right? Like, go for it. Like, I would love for you to be more popular. And there is, but like in my case, writing about an obscure school of ancient philosophy, it's not easy. And making it interesting to people who are not interested in that thing is hard. And sometimes people just think being right about something or caring about something is sufficient to reach a mass audience for it. And there's a skill and a science to it and an understanding to it. And there has to be an openness to using different tools and different mediums. Yeah. And if those people are not going to do it, whether we're talking about Stoicism or talking about public health, what you're effectively doing is ceding the field to someone else. Yeah. And you're not always going to like how those people do it. And so what I was trying to say in Trust Me, I'm Lying is like, hey, look, I'm using this stuff to sell like T-shirts or books, low stakes items. Somebody else who's much more motivated than me or my clients is going to do it for things that are much worse. And if you don't figure out how to either close these loopholes or figure out how to, in the Army, they talk about control the battle space. If you don't figure out how to control the battle space, you are ceding it to someone else, and you are not going to like what they do with that space.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think the one thing that I have liked about your work is you tell stories.
Yes.
And this was always, I think, the thing where, and that's what my team at Stanford, we were never, the motivating factor was never to put out academic papers, right? We did that. We kind of had to, like check the box. But it was, how do you explain to people in this moment when it matters why they see a thing that they see, or how a thing works, or how a scam works, or how to think about some, new, and like how to think about generative AI, for example, right? How do we explain this using compelling stories? Yes. And it's a very different style of writing. It's a very different style of thinking, right? You want people to hear the story and to go with it. And I remember, again, the vaccine law in California, nothing we did was to put out stats and fact checks, and here is why measles vaccines are very important.
We argue with you about the science of how it works.
Right, we're not going to do that. We're going to, here's a kid with leukemia who can't go to school right now.
Yes.
Right? And that's where I have found that even during COVID, the thing that we saw most often, the thing that went most viral was human stories.
Yes.
And the people who tried to put out counter-human stories, right, the public health folks, were the frontline doctors, not the institutions. They didn't, they were out there with the stats and the, droplets traveling X number of feet at this velocity or whatever. And then you've got the doctors who are like, here's a morgue truck parked outside my hospital, right? And one thing that we kept trying to think about is like, how do you elevate those people? How do you make those people your communicators when I remember, again, the story I was telling about like measles and Samoa and stuff like that. So Facebook then decides, okay, well, we have some problems here. What do we do about this? And holding aside the specifics of that particular crisis, they then have to ask questions like, when people are searching for information, what do I show them? And I remember having a conversation with somebody at the platform who was like, we can up-level, we can return a carousel of CDC content up at the top of the page and no one will read it.
Yes.
And no one will share it. It's not interesting. And you can't, you're fighting like, you're like bringing facts to a knife fight over here. And the question of what do you surface? Who is both authoritative enough and also interesting enough? And there were huge gaps there. And that, I think, positioned us, it put us in the absolute worst possible place. Yeah. And I'm not sure that lesson was really internalized, unfortunately. Like, I don't think that's really been, that was the takeaway for
you
people.
got to explain how the system works and then why this is a preferable outcome or process than this one. And I think politically we're doing a horrible job of that. I was thinking of one more Marcus Aurelius quote we were talking about preaching to the converted people or not converted people. He has this quote. He says, like, okay, so you meet a shameless person or a frustrating or annoying person, and he goes, ask yourself, is a world without such people possible? Like, is there a world without shameless or annoying or incorrect people possible? And you go, no, of course not.
Yeah.
And then, so he's like, okay, so this is one of them. Like, they're a percentage of a whole. You have to accept that and move on. And I thought about this during the vaccine stuff. I thought about it during COVID. I think about it during politics. It's like, look, you were never going to get to 100%. That doesn't exist. You're never going to get to 100%. So 5%, 10%, 20%, there's some number of people who are just off the table for you. The sooner you accept that and stop arguing with those people, then you can reach the 80%, the 85%, the 90% or whatever. And I find from a communication standpoint, people just spend all their time arguing with the people that are the percentage that was always going to exist and have always existed. There's always been crazy people. There's always been people who are wrong. There's always just been mercenary people and bad actors and and it's our outrage that exists that bogs us down. And then what we're doing is ignoring the what's actually a pretty sizable majority that is persuadable or is convincible, is interested. And not only are we ignoring them, but we're actually drawing more attention to these people, the bad people, who are then exposing themselves to the larger group. And so it's this super ineffective, like naive sense of the world that I think is at the root of why we can't seem to get ourselves out of some of these messes.
How do you think about in the work that you did or do that where is the role for positive influence, if you will? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah,
conscripting people into it, maybe, or like making people feel that that they have a I don't know, maybe the same sort of perhaps idealistic but kind of ethical underpinnings that journalism did eventually evolve into. Is there a mechanism for convincing influencers that is actually like not a bad framework to operate under? Yeah,
it's funny. I think one of the big things that helped turn journalism around from the yellow journalism was the invention of like journalism awards. There was clubs. They articulated like a code of conduct or created a sort of set of cultural assumptions about what it meant. And all these things were limiting, I'm sure, in many ways, and frustrating in other ways, and elitist in some ways. Yeah. But it had the effect of acting on as a governor against some of the either naked self-interest or sort of worst human impulses. And so, yeah, I think about how do you, this is obviously what my new book is about, but like, what is the code of conduct or bylaws for your profession?
Yeah.
You can't enforce it on other people, but you can set them for yourself. And then I think by communicating about them and talking about them, you can create a positive culture where people are aspiring to be like those things. And look, we've seen positive examples of these in positive feedback loops in history. Like Whole Foods has created obviously a whole bunch of incentives. Some of it's nonsense, and some of it is like sort of corporate greenwashing. But where people are now competing to be more ethical as opposed to cheaper or have higher standards instead of lower standards. And I think the best way to do that is not sort of mandated from on high, but by creating a powerful example that is working and is successful, and then people want to be more like that thing. And so I don't think we can't just dismiss the role of good people doing good things, talking about why they do it their way, and hopefully that becomes contagious also. And there's a handful of accounts out there and people out there who go like, I really like that person. I really like the standards they set. If more people were like this, it would be better. And that sort of example, I think, is important. And yeah, the government didn't come in and say, hey, this is how journalism has to be. The profession policed itself. Yeah. But I mean, it did some nasty stuff along the way.
Yeah. It was a fascinating history, I think. I spend a bunch of time in the book trying to connect the dots back to those periods. I do think that there's this sense of like these, kind of halcyon days of, Dan Rather or whomever being the sort of moral authority and kind of shedding a light on like that. It wasn't, we have a kind of rosy view of that period, not necessarily accurate. But what is the future of a lot of these things? You're seeing influencers you're seeing the FTC start to come in some ways, like, hey, from a, moving beyond ethics to consumer protection, you're starting to see the FEC has largely punted, right? It doesn't want to have to weigh in.
I think some lawsuits, some of the defamation lawsuits and stuff will kind of set some absolute bottom lines, like you can't do X. But ultimately, I think it's like, look, a court can come in and say, look, Alex Jones, you can't say this, like, and here are the consequences for having said this. And that's obviously powerful. But I think what actually has to happen is, and I can't understand why this isn't happening, is people need to stop fucking having him on. Like, I just don't understand what that is. I
think we're in the, in this arc of contrarianism is the highest good kind of model, right? Which is I like the reflexive contrarianism. It's not a thoughtful contrarianism.
These people hate this person. I like
them.
Person.
Yeah, exactly. And so especially as
that's a good way to be real stupid and get yourself in
narratives
trouble.
Around. Right. Yeah. Exactly. It's just the this is like what they don't want you to hear, and so we're going to have this person on because it is, but it does galvanize attention, right? I mean, media, I remember when it was like Rogan or something had him back on at some point and, just kind of let him talk, right? Yeah. And that's the other piece where every now and then I'm like, come on, just maybe make a counterpoint somewhere in that monologue.
I think that's been the problem with podcasting is that it's very vulnerable as a medium if you, the host or person, don't insist on there being some sort of truth. It becomes this kind of both sidesism, or just like you don't realize they're platforming the idea, and some percentage of people are hearing it for the first time and liking it. Yeah, and that I think you have a responsibility to not do that.
There was a whole media cycle about that, though, about Rogan having him on, right?
Yeah.
There again, this notion of the sort of the weird spectacle, the image, if you will, where man has man on podcast, and then there's an entire media cycle about the ethics of that, which is fine. It's a reasonable question, but then it turns into the media doesn't want you to hear him, and so it drives more attention to it in a way. And so this question of how do you handle the sort of multi-tiered dynamics that are going to come in as one group is outraged and another group doubles down and so on and so forth, and it just becomes well, we're sticking it to those guys over there, and that's really kind of what drives our politics at this point.
I think so. You want to go check out some books?
Yeah, let's do it.